Now we've had this grouse against you, Honda. We've had so much of your commuter focus in India. We really wanted something fun from you, something from your illustrious performance-oriented portfolio globally. And now we thank you, for clearly you've listened to us. Ladies and gentlemen, say hallelujah and welcome the CBR 650F. Now I begin with a disclaimer. Design is subjective. What works for you might not work for me and vice versa. But I do think that the Honda's design is very subdued, especially when you compare it to the likes of the mean and aggressive looking Kawasaki's or the funky looking KTM's. The Honda, on the other hand, is quite restrained. Now this restraint might not be everybody's cup of tea. For me personally, I think I could live with it. There are things that I really like about this design. Now this restraint really works from the back, especially if you put a tail tidy and get rid of the sari guard. I like the fact that the fairing is layered and it gives you just enough of a glimpse of the engine. It also shows you the four pipes coming out of the cylinder head, which gives it away that it is an inline four and not just a twin. I've also read reports earlier about the build quality of the 650F being a little questionable. Well, I have the bike in flesh and I think I would completely disagree. I think this is a really well-made motorcycle and I think this is the standard that Honda should have across its entire range of motorcycles in India. The dials are digital and do the job they're supposed to in giving out relevant information in a well laid out manner, but they are in fact quite average to look at. The mirrors definitely need a miss. They seem to belong on a unicorn. I would have preferred more contemporary ones to go with the rest of the design. I like the fact that the 650F has clip-on handlebars and a nice tall windscreen that you will appreciate at high speeds, but neither is adjustable. Unlike supersports and racing machines, you don't really have the option of going single-seater. The banana seats take away your excuse for refusing a pillion. Okay, so overall, we might not have reached a consensus about her when stationary. How about we take her for a spin to find out what she's about in motion? The 650F gets a 649cc inline 4 and boy am I glad it's an inline 4 and not a twin. Now sure, it's not close to the level of performance of the 600RR's inline 4 and unlike the Yamaha FZ6 which has a down-tuned version of the R6's engine, this is an all-new engine. But it still gets the inherent characteristics of a 4-cylinder motor. Now when Honda were building this all-new engine, the mandate never really was outright power, it was more affordability and the intent of producing unintimidating and usable power. So the engineering on this over-square motor isn't really all that complicated. The real pull comes after about 3000 RPM. The motor is at its most comfortable at between 4000 and 8000 RPM. But if you give it the beams, it'll redline all the way up to 11,400 RPM. But the grunt does tend to taper off after about 8000 RPM. The 86.5 PS of max power and 63 Nm of max torque aren't blood-curdling and you won't be pulling any unwanted power beams, but it's got enough muscle to push it past 230 km an hour, with 100 km an hour coming in just under 5 seconds. However, if you use it in the right power band, it's also capable of pulling on for over 23 km on a single litre of petrol, which is an impressive balance between performance and mileage in anyone's book. One reason I'm an absolute sucker for 4-cylinder motorcycles, as I'm sure many enthusiasts across the world are, as opposed to say a twin or a single cylinder, is of course the sound of the engine, the high frequency shriek of an inline 4 engine. Now you'd expect that off the 650F as well. But it's just too subdued and too muffled. Now I know that Honda keeps saying that the wild doesn't always scream, but it needs to. We're not talking about fashion statements here. We're talking about an inline 4 for God's sakes. Thankfully, nothing an aftermarket exhaust can't solve. The riding position and ergonomics are well suited for my sub 6 foot height, but at 810 mm the seat sits higher than sportier machines like the 600RR, and for shorter riders that could be a problem. Riding position isn't completely upright, so you can tuck in under the windscreen, but it isn't too forward leaning so as to hurt your arms during long distance rides. Though I would have liked larger support plates on the rear sets to hold your boots better while cornering. The suspension setup on the 650F is a fairly basic one, so once again indicative of the fact that this bike is aimed at the beginner and not so much the expert. So at the front you have the right side up telescopic forks as opposed to the upside down ones. At the back you have monoshocks with only preload adjustment. Now preload adjustment is a very basic form of adjustment. It only lets you set the travel for when you have a pillion or you're riding with luggage. Now effectively you're working with only one preset suspension setup that Honda has for you, but thankfully this setup works really well in our conditions. Now, the role of a suspension is not just to soak up all the different forms of undulations on our road, which this bike does really well, but it is also to keep the tires in contact with the tarmac at all times. Now, this is what gives the 650F a lot of confidence. It inspires a lot of confidence in the rider at all speeds and at all lean angles. The 650F has excellent road mannerisms, to say the least. Now, it's got a far better brake setup than the Ninja 650. It's got ABS as standard, unlike the Quacker, and the chassis is just so balanced. Now, that is expected of a Honda, but I got back to riding after a very long break. The chassis just responds to rider inputs so amicably and with so much precision. Now, I can imagine this being a complete boon for beginners and sporadic intermediates like me, but for experts, it just might not be that much of a challenge. The 180 section Dunlops do one hell of a job, aided by the chassis of course, and at no point do they threaten to give away unless you do something erratic with the throttle or the brakes. In fact, I think the 650F would have been an even sublime handler had it a smaller section rear tire. It would have made it even nimbler despite its bulk. Now sure, there are a lot of positives about this bike, but you need to know about a few negatives as well, which might not be too significant for you, but they're niggles nonetheless. Now firstly, there is a high frequency vibration that is expelled from the inline-4 engine onto your handlebars. Now, if you're doing shorter stints in the city, you probably won't even notice this, but if you're out on the highway riding for at least an hour or two, it's probably going to leave your hands just a little bit tingly. Negative number 2 is engine heat. Now, it's a given that all big bikes are supposed to heat up a lot, especially if you have a fairing that hinders natural air cooling. But if you see this particular arrangement of this engine, the crankcase has been pulled back while the cylinder head is leaning forward. This is for better weight distribution. But if you see the riding position, your right shin ends up right next to the clutch cover, and this is going to get quite hot, especially in stop-and-go traffic. And God help you if you're riding in shorts. No, seriously, God help you, because heat or no heat, that's just plain stupid. And finally, the third negative, and this is the big one, is the pricing. Now, Honda had the opportunity to price the CBR 650F very competitively because it is a CKD. It will be assembled in India, but at rupees 8.3 lakh on road in Mumbai, it is about 2.2 lakhs more expensive than the Ninja 650, and it's just a little cheaper than the more powerful Z800. Now, that's a bit of a bummer because, you know, there is such a strong case to be made for a strong inline-4 entry-level motorcycle in India, and well, Honda have just priced it a little bit on the higher side. But well, to sum it up, if you don't mind paying a little bit extra for the inline-4 engine, you're looking for, well, Honda's engineering, and you're looking for a bike that doesn't intimidate you, well, the CBR 650F is definitely worth a shot.